Can a world champion be completely defenseless against a car that simply falls apart in his hands? What is happening with Ferrari, and why doesn't Vasseur understand what he saw in Austin? Frédéric Vasseur's surprise during the 2025 United States Grand Prix was not minor. In fact, to understand the magnitude of his confusion, it is necessary to go back to the early hours of Friday in Austin, where the paddock began to move with a peculiar energy. Ferrari, which arrived at the Circuit of the Americas with the intention of confirming the promised improvements in the SF25, experienced an initial day that, in the eyes of many, seemed to mark the beginning of a technical turning point. The feelings were very positive. For the first time in a long time, there was consensus in the garage. The car not only looked competitive but also predictable. That predictable word had been a constant desire since the beginning of the project. During the only free practice session of the weekend, Lewis Hamilton, in just his third Grand Prix dressed in red, signed a performance that left several engineers within the Ferrari wall speechless. It wasn't just his time of 1 minute and 33.685 seconds that caught the eye, but how he achieved it. The Briton seemed comfortable in a car that in the previous weeks had forced him to change his driving style. Its lines were clean, its cornering constant, and in the long sectors the SF25 seemed to finally have a solid base. The telemetry data was encouraging. The car maintained the optimal temperature in the medium tires and showed a stable platform, especially in medium-speed corners, where in the recent past Ferrari had lost time alarmingly. Finally, there was something resembling technical stability. Vasseur did not hide his relief. During morning interviews, his body language conveyed a mix of caution and satisfaction. He spoke with moderation, yes, but for the first time this season he did not have to justify the lack of rhythm or hide behind promises of future improvements. Everything indicated that Ferrari had taken a step in the right direction. The SF25, although still temperamental, seemed to have the potential to fight for forward positions. For Vasseur, who had publicly defended the signing of Hamilton as a long-term strategic investment, seeing the 7-time champion adapt so quickly was the validation he needed. At times he even allowed himself to smile on the wall. But that tranquility lasted exactly until qualifying began. What came next was a brutal and unexpected turn, one of those situations that destroy the internal morale of a team in a matter of minutes. Hamilton barely managed to advance to SQ3 by a ridiculous difference of 6 thousandths, beating Kimi Antonelli, the young Mercedes driver, by a whisker. The most alarming thing was not just the margin, but how the car, which just hours before was behaving stable and coherent, became progressively unmanageable. Suddenly, the SF25 began to show the same symptoms that had plagued it throughout the beginning of the season. Unpredictable oversteer, loss of traction in slow corners, and a total disconnect between what the data promised and what the car delivered on the track. Hamilton finished 8th, almost a full second off the pole time, and teammate Charles Leclerc was even slower. The expression on Vasseur's face at the end of the session said it all. What began as a hopeful day ended in a bath of reality. The classification had been a sharp and direct blow to Ferrari's aspirations. And for a team that had been looking for consistency for years, experiencing such a bipolar day was devastating. The question that arose at that moment was the same one that ran through the corridors of the Maranello hospitality. How is it possible that a car can collapse so dramatically in a matter of hours? No one had the answer, at least at that moment. Not Vasseur, not the engineers, not Hamilton. The only thing left was the frustration of having had an opportunity in our hands, and having seen it vanish without apparent explanation. One more time. The SF25's performance drop during qualifying in Austin was much more than just a bad day. It was the visible manifestation of a deep, structural, and, most worrying for Ferrari, still poorly understood problem. To casual spectators it may simply appear that the car had no rhythm. But for the technicians and engineers who analyzed the behavior of a Formula One car layer by layer, what happened at the United States GP was a case study on what should not happen when designing a high-performance car. The SF25 didn't just lose performance, lost its identity as a technical platform. One of the first problems detected, and perhaps the most decisive, is the car's absurdly narrow aerodynamic operating window. From its conception, Ferrari opted for an aggressive design that sought to maximize ground effect. That meant rolling the car at minimum heights, just millimeters from the asphalt. In theory, this strategy would maximize the downforce generated by the flat bottom. But this decision has a dangerous consequence. Any small alteration in the height of the car, whether due to skid wear or a change in the suspension configuration, causes a disproportionate loss of aerodynamic load. While teams like McLaren or Mercedes can lose between 3 and 5 points of downforce if they raise their car, the SF25 can lose between 10 and 15. It is a critical difference that translates directly into lack of grip, loss of stability, and a constant feeling of uncertainty behind the wheel. That type of design forces you to always operate on a knife's edge. If everything is in place, the car can be competitive. But if you go even slightly outside of that very narrow range, performance collapses. And that's exactly what happened in Austin. The track conditions, added to a configuration possibly forced by skid wear, forced the rolling height to be raised. The result was immediate. The SF25 became unpredictable, particularly in high-speed corners, where the aerodynamic flow must remain stable to avoid imbalances between the front and rear axle. The second big problem was the thermal management of the car. Austin presented one of the most demanding conditions on the calendar. Temperatures above 30 degrees in the environment and more than 50 on the asphalt. And there, SF25 simply collapsed. The rear tires began to overheat from the first fast laps, completely going out of their performance window. This caused loss of traction on corner exits, premature degradation, and above all, a complete inability to maintain the pace lap after lap. For a driver like Hamilton, whose strength lies in his perseverance and ability to extract the maximum from the tire in each phase, this phenomenon represented an insurmountable barrier. It didn't matter how much he adjusted his style. The car was not responding. In fact, telemetry comparisons showed that in several key corners, Hamilton lost between 7 and 10 km per hour in minimum speed compared to the McLaren and Red Bull. That, translated into lap time, means between 3 and 5 tenths in just one sector. And that's not counting the additional losses due to lack of traction or errors caused by a car that never behaves the same 2 laps in a row. Overall, the SF25 is not a slow car. It is an unstable car. And that instability is what is killing Ferrari's performance. Technically, it's like building an airplane that only flies well in perfect atmospheric conditions. But Formula One does not offer that luxury. The slopes change, the temperature changes, the wind changes. If a car can't adapt, then it can't win. And at this time, the SF25 does not adapt. It reacts unpredictably. And that is a death sentence in the fight for a championship. When Lewis Hamilton stepped out of the SF25 at the end of qualifying in Austin, he was not the same driver who had taken to the track hours earlier with renewed confidence. What we saw was not just a multiple world champion disappointed by a poor performance. It was a rare, almost unprecedented portrait of vulnerability in one of the most mentally strong competitors of the modern era of Formula One. His tone of voice on the radio, his body language in the paddock, his brief but eloquent statements afterwards, all reflected the disorientation of someone who, for the first time in a long time, found himself in the middle of a technical storm from which he could not escape. Hamilton is known for being a driver who finds solutions. For more than a decade at Mercedes, he faced all kinds of technical challenges: overheating problems, loss of charge, poorly executed strategies. But rarely, if ever, did we see him admit so openly that he didn't understand what had happened. His message to the team during SQ3 was clear and brutal in its honesty. "I really don't know what happened. It looked good in practice. And then it just fell apart." That word "crumbled" is not minor. He did not say that the car was not competitive or that it lacked some rhythm. He said everything fell apart, that the car disintegrated in terms of handling and performance. And therein lies what is truly alarming. It was not a case of lack of commitment, nor of poor execution. It was a sign that the SF25, at least in certain conditions, cannot offer the pilot a predictable platform. When the car transforms in a matter of minutes and stops responding to any change in setup or driving style, what is left is a trapped driver. And in that state, not even the most talented can shine. That is why what was experienced in Austin was more than a failed classification. It was a warning, a wake-up call for Ferrari. Because if Hamilton, with all his experience, with all his tactical intelligence, with all his ability to adapt, can't make sense of what the car is doing, then there is a deeper problem than any stopwatch can reflect. This dilemma has no simple answers, but it does have consequences. What happens in the next races can mark the future not only of the championship, but of the Ferrari project as we know it. Therefore, it is important to follow every step, every session, every technical decision made from now on. Because if Ferrari manages to reverse the situation, it will be a redemption story worthy of the books. But if he doesn't, it will be another season in which potential is left halfway. Do you think Ferrari can save its season with the SF25? Or are we facing another year of unfulfilled promises in Maranello? Leave it to me in the comments.